Yeah, so those kinds of things, those kinds of mindsets often come about through a variety of traumatic childhood experiences. And traumatic experiences, take a look. It changes gene expression. So think about just the maltreatment changes the way genes are expressed. And you know, these can gene changes be turned off once they're turned on? That's really, you know, that's an interesting thing. Can we turn off some of these genetic changes? These would be epigenetic changes that occur as a result of maltreatment. Now, one of the most important people in terms of psychotherapy for depression is Aaron Beck. And Aaron Beck is the guy who developed cognitive therapy for depression. And so he's the person who really began this idea of cognitive restructuring for people who are depressed. Because if you think about it, if through whatever experiences one had in childhood, if the result is a depressive train of thought or a depressive schema, and the theme is loss or failure or rejection or worthlessness or, you know, any number of negative ways we can think about ourselves, then if that's the case, that individual is a good candidate for cognitive therapy. And there are variations on it. There's a variation on it called cognitive behavior therapy. But the aim is to change the way a person is thinking about himself or herself. The aim is to change a dysfunctional depressive schema into a functional schema. And it's doable. It is achievable. And so one nice thing about this approach is that it can produce positive long-term outcomes. And you can get those long-term outcomes without drugs. Now, hopelessness theory really is kind of goes back to the it's related to learned helplessness. Helplessness and hopelessness are pretty closely related. People learn to be hopeless, they learn to be helpless. But this is just a kind of negative thinking. It's hopeless, you know, why try? Everything's going to turn out badly anyway. Yeah, so think about it. I mean, it's very easy to kind of fall into that mindset, a hopeless mindset. So just think of hopelessness, defined on the top of page 578. Hopelessness is an expectation that unpleasant outcomes will occur or that desired outcomes will not occur and that there is nothing one can do to prevent them. I can't do anything about it, so why even try? Nothing's going to get any better. We probably all know someone who talks like this. And people who talk like this tend to be depressed people. Rumination. Rumination is really just dwelling on your depressive symptoms and your negative thoughts. You're just dwelling on it. So rumination, think about it, that has some elements in common with obsession. but it's like an obsession with your negative thinking, dwelling on your depressive symptoms, dwelling on your negative thoughts, dwelling on a negative self-image, for instance. So depressed people tend to ruminate more. Now women are diagnosed with depression more, and women tend to ruminate more than men do. There's a difference in men and women who are depressed. Depressed women tend to ruminate more than depressed men. That's not to say there aren't depressed men who ruminate. Of course there are. And then suicide. Suicide's, you know, the biggest risk of major depressive disorder. And so you can see it's just death caused by self-directed injurious behavior with the intent to die as a result of the behavior. So take a look. Suicide, 10th leading cause of death for all ages. An average of 105 suicides each day in 2010. 4 times higher among females and accounts for 79% of all suicides. Firearms are most commonly used in males, whereas poisoning most commonly used for females. Usually an overdose of pills, sleeping pills, for instance. Suicide rates are increasing for people who are 65 years and older. Suicide rates among adults in their prime, 25 to 64, have risen consistently. And then, you know, we could probably say that there's an association with stress level. Let's see. Suicide rates are highest among Native Americans and non-Hispanic whites. People in the Mountain West kill themselves more frequently than in other parts of the country. Let's see. Okay, let's go ahead and start the section on schizophrenia. One way to think about schizophrenia is it's really a set of disorders that are related to each other. Probably the main feature of schizophrenia is that it's characterized by disorganized thinking. There are, according to the definition here, major disturbances in thought, perception, emotion, and behavior. There is typically a serious breakdown in functionality. This disorder is debilitating in terms of a person being able to function at home, function at work, function in school, and so forth. Schizophrenia affects approximately 1% of the population, and this is pretty steady at 1% worldwide. The term schizophrenia comes from Eugen Bleuler, and it means a splitting of the emotions from the intellect. A splitting of the emotions from the intellect. People with schizophrenia are considered to be psychotic. So when there is a significant breakdown in a person's ability to think, to just engage in normal behavior like keeping up with personal hygiene, often that is the result of a psychotic break. Symptoms of schizophrenia typically fall in two categories: positive symptoms and negative symptoms. Positive symptoms are characterized by the presence of something that didn't used to be present. So the person used to be okay, used to be able to function just fine, and now there are these symptoms and the person is not functioning. So that's what a positive symptom is: something that is present now but didn't used to be present. So examples of positive symptoms would be hallucinations and delusions. Hallucination is the experience of a perception without corresponding sensory input. So the person is typically seeing or more frequently hearing something, and there's nothing present in the environment to correspond with what the person hears. Auditory hallucinations are the most common type of hallucinations experienced in schizophrenia. Delusions are beliefs that are contrary to reality and firmly held even in the face of contradictory evidence. Delusions are beliefs that cannot possibly be true. There are three types that are mentioned in your book: paranoid delusions, and paranoid delusions would be a belief, a strong belief that some other people or agencies or entities are out to do one harm. So I guess the catchphrase you may have heard is, "They're out to get me." And so they or them is often the content, or that would be the delusion. So it could be space aliens or the CIA or so forth, but if there's no evidence for it, no evidence at all, then that thinking is delusional. Grandiose delusions would be the belief that someone is uniquely powerful or uniquely special or extremely important. A somatic delusion would be that there is something different about the body. And for instance, a belief that one's kidneys are being eaten by cockroaches. It's just something that is just, we would think that's off the wall. There's no way that could possibly be true. That would be a somatic delusion. There are also delusions of reference. So this would be something like, say, you're watching a TV newscast and the newscaster is sending you coded messages through blinking his or her eyes. That would be a delusion of reference. If you've ever seen the movie A Beautiful Mind, the main character, John Nash, had delusions of reference. He was grandiose in the sense that he was working for the government and he was decoding messages, messages from the government's enemies, and he would see these patterns in newspaper or magazine articles. But the patterns, the patterns that he saw are reference, essentially. There's something in an innocuous newspaper article or newspaper story that carries some special significance to the person. So that's sometimes referred to as a delusion of reference. Pretty much all forms of schizophrenia are characterized by disorganized thinking. Having a disjointed or incoherent thought process, not being able to maintain a steady train of thought, getting derailed. Speech derailment is very common, where a person just cannot stay on a particular topic but tends to bounce from one topic to another. That's called derailed speech or speech derailment, and that's pretty emblematic of disorganized thinking, the underlying thinking. Also, there are motor symptoms. It could be just being overly fidgety, or it could be what we might call stereotypical behavior, pacing back and forth, or making movements like swinging a golf club, although no golf club is held. The person's just making a repetitive movement like that. That's relatively common. Also, some people just kind of freeze up and don't move at all. That's usually referred to as catatonia. And there's a decreased reactivity to the environment, but also when people are catatonic, they hold very uncomfortable postures for sometimes hours at a time. Catatonic postures exhibit something called waxy flexibility. Waxy flexibility is essentially posability. So the person who's holding this uncomfortable posture can be moved or posed as a mannequin might be moved or posed. Other examples of negative symptoms, and negative symptoms just something that's absent that used to be there. So like the ability to walk around and move, that would be a negative symptom. Catatonic behavior would be negative, but also affective flattening, not being able to smile and laugh where one used to be able to smile and laugh. Now that's gone, so something that used to be there isn't there anymore. So flattened affect is something that's pretty common as a negative symptom. But it could also be something like anhedonia. Anhedonia, again, is just a loss of interest or pleasure in activities that before used to give someone pleasure. So anhedonia could also be a negative symptom of schizophrenia. Now, causes of schizophrenia. There are a number of possible causes, so we'll just go through them in sequence here. First of all, there is a heritable component to schizophrenia. The heritability of schizophrenia is about 0.48. That's relatively high. So if you have a pair of identical twins, monozygotic twins, and one of the twins has schizophrenia, about half the time the other twin will have schizophrenia. So there is a pretty strong genetic component. And then we could also talk about epigenetics, factors that are involved in the expression of genes. So it's possible, for instance, for someone to have genes for the disorder, but they are not expressed. There seems to be what we might call a diathesis. Some people have a predisposition. For instance, it runs in the family. There's some possibility that someone has genes for it. Well, if someone has genes for schizophrenia, but has a happy, relatively carefree life, those genes may never be expressed. But one thing that is pretty clear is that people who lead more stressful lives, if they live in a family where there is a lot of stress, then the symptoms typically do show up with greater frequency. So there is a relationship to stress. So we could certainly apply the diathesis stress model to schizophrenia. In terms of neurotransmitters, the one that's been studied most heavily is dopamine. drugs that reduce levels of dopamine at synapses typically help the symptoms improve. So people do better if they can get their dopamine levels reduced with drugs that reduce dopamine levels. So that's good. There is also an association with serotonin, especially at the 5-HT2 receptor, and there is an association with glutamate. Drugs that block glutamate, like PCP, can cause a full-blown psychotic episode that is indistinguishable from we could say a normal or non-drug induced psychotic episode. So there are at least 3 neurotransmitter systems that are being studied pretty heavily, but dopamine is the one that seems to be most involved in the symptomatology of schizophrenia. In terms of brain anatomy, whenever you have enlarged ventricles, you are losing brain matter. Enlarged ventricles always mean that brain matter is being lost, and that means that the disease is progressive, and it is a degenerative disease. So there is cell loss in schizophrenia. And we also see enlarged ventricles in disorders such as Alzheimer's, where there's massive cell loss, massive neuron loss. So there are also abnormalities in the frontal cortex that are associated with schizophrenia. So, but generally speaking, if you have cell loss, especially in the frontal cortex, and also enlarged ventricles, which is just a kind of ready measure for cell loss, that's associated with a number of degenerative diseases. Events occurring during pregnancy. Well, one thing that occurs during pregnancy is neuronal migration. There's a kind of glial cell called a radial glial cell. Radial glial cells attach to newly formed neurons and carry them to their permanent locations in the cortex. And what happens is the process occurs prenatally, and if that process is going on, the neurons are being formed and then migrated, there are certain things that can disrupt the migration. And one thing that can disrupt neuronal migration is influenza. If mom gets the flu while she's pregnant, the child, when he or she hits, say, 18 to 20, 22 years old, that child is more likely to exhibit symptoms of schizophrenia. So influenza then would be what we would call a teratogen. It's something that can cause damage. Now, another factor that's linked to schizophrenia is marijuana use. Well, one thing that is symptomatic of marijuana use, especially in some users, is that some people, when they ingest or smoke marijuana, they get paranoid. I mean, they get very activated, and often they have a strong belief that someone is after them. So the paranoid delusions are common sometimes just in people who smoke marijuana. Well, imagine someone who has a diathesis for schizophrenia, someone who has a genetic predisposition for schizophrenia, and they smoke some high-test marijuana, something with a very high THC content, that could spark off a psychotic episode. Early warning signs. Usually before there is a full-blown psychotic episode or psychotic break, there are what we call prodromal symptoms. And these are just essentially, this would be odd behavior that occurs before something more serious occurs. So there may be some deterioration in functioning, but the person's still getting by. These are called prodromal symptoms. And a person who is starting to show problems in functioning, and also there is a history of schizophrenia in the family, that's someone to watch pretty closely. So that's the wrap up of schizophrenia. Let's move into dissociative disorders. And I want to scroll down just a little bit here. There are really two types of dissociation. Dissociation is essentially a disruption of one's sense of self. There's a disruption or a detachment from one's self. And typically we call that depersonalization. Depersonalization is a disruption or a detachment from one's self. Derealization is the sense that the world has changed. Perhaps the self has remained relatively continuous, but something about the world has changed. Perhaps other people just seem to be altered or different, or the world itself is altered or different in some way that just seems unfamiliar. That is derealization. And so there are aspects of dissociative problems that are either focused on depersonalization or derealization, and of course both could occur in the same individual at the same time. Now, one kind of dissociative disorder, and is not uncommon one, it's called dissociative amnesia. And this would just be essentially not remembering one's self, not remembering who you are, losing the sense of personal identity. That would be dissociative amnesia. And this could be sparked off by a stressful or traumatic experience. And so sometimes people who have experienced a trauma just kind of lose sense of who they are. Dissociative fugue means that the person has typically, this goes with dissociative amnesia, but the person moves to a new location. All right, the person winds up in a new location frequently with also a loss of personal identity. And every so often you'll hear a news story about someone who just disappears and then maybe is found a few years later having assumed a new identity, maybe even started a new family. And left the old family behind, started a new family, and still has no idea who he or she used to be. Those are cases of dissociative fugue. Now, the granddaddy of all the dissociative disorders is called dissociative identity disorder. Dissociative identity disorder is where there are multiple distinct formed personalities in the same person. So we have one person but multiple personalities. It was formerly called multiple personality disorder, but dissociative identity disorder, I think, really explains it a little better. Um, Dissociative identities, often identities will not have knowledge of each other, um, so that often there is one of the identities that tends to be dominant, tends to control the others. Um, Sometimes the identities can be different genders, so there can be male and female identities in the same person. Um, the different identities that a person has are sometimes called alters, and changing from one identity to another is called a switch. Um, this disorder is invariably traced back to traumatic experiences in childhood. Children, especially highly imaginative children, for instance, children who have imaginary friends, who then also experience a severe trauma, such as, let's say, a sexual assault or molestation, those individuals are often the most at risk for developing dissociative identity disorder. Now, personality disorders are really characterized by patterns of behavior that are maladaptive. So that's one way we could think about them. Personality disorders are characterized by maladaptive patterns of behavior that are pretty ingrained. Think about it. If a pattern of behavior is part of one's personality, it is consistent across time and situations, and that's how personality disorders work, except when we talk about personality disorders, we're talking about maladaptive patterns of behavior. So these disorders in the DSM are classified into clusters. So there's cluster A, cluster B, and cluster C. So we can look at cluster A. We have paranoid personality, schizoid personality disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. So this cluster would be, there are psychotic features. So there's a long-standing pattern of psychotic features, but typically the person has not had a total breakdown in functioning. So the person is typically at least partly functional. When you get into cluster B, these are the ones you probably heard the most about. We have antisocial personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and borderline personality disorder. So antisocial personalities, this is associated with psychopathy, usually a lack of empathy for other people. These individuals have a hard time or really just no capacity to feel empathy for others. Often their behavior is manipulative and abusive. There usually is poor impulse control and a high likelihood for engaging in activities that are highly stimulating, like being attracted to drugs or alcohol. So that people, antisocial personalities typically like stimulants and they like alcohol. They tend to engage in behavior that is highly stimulating, like picking fights, for instance. It may not surprise you that a lot of people with antisocial personality disorder are in prison. These individuals typically have a history in school, first of all, of conduct disorder. These were the kids who were always getting in trouble, but they just kind of stay in trouble, and instead of getting sent to the principal's office, they have run-ins with the law and often eventually wind up behind bars. Histrionic personalities, these are the people who absolutely have to be the center of attention. Narcissistic personalities, this would be, and there are different types of narcissistic personalities, but narcissistic personality disorder would be someone who usually lacks empathy, but also, really believes that he or she is someone special, someone who deserves special treatment. There is a high level of self-importance and typically a high level of grandiosity. Let's see, borderline personality disorder. One thing that people with borderline personality disorder fear is abandonment. They fear abandonment, yet their behavior is hard to be around, and so there are often people who are abandoned, or just people who, once they get to know them, just don't want anything more to do with them. Borderline personality disorder is also associated with self-harm. So sometimes people will harm themselves. You may have heard of people cutting their arms with razor blades. That kind of behavior is not uncommon in individuals with borderline personality disorder. When we get into cluster C, we have avoidant personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. I want to just tell you a little bit about obsessive compulsive personality disorder, or OCPD, because it is not the same thing as OCD. OCPD is really an exaggerated need for control. So these people are very self-controlled, but also very controlling of others. They would be the proverbial control freaks, the people who are very hard to be around because they are so controlling. So that's really the difference. This would be, we might think in terms of big five personality traits. These are the people with exaggerated conscientiousness. It's like conscientiousness run amok. So that's what characterizes OCPD. So there, I've told you about a few of these. So you can take a look at the personality disorders and the clusters. And I've mentioned some of the more common ones. One thing about borderline personality disorder is it tends to be diagnosed primarily among women. So females are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder at a much higher rate than males are. It's certainly possible for a male to have borderline personality disorder, but most of the people diagnosed with it are female. It often is traceable to usually a difficult or an abusive childhood. So these individuals often were traumatized in one way or another during childhood. So usually the behavior patterns in the personality disorders are traceable to childhood. Antisocial personality disorder, I've mentioned a little bit. But usually, I mentioned it starts as something called conduct disorder. So again, think of the kid who frequently got sent to the principal's office, was always getting in trouble, and this is a pattern that tends to persist. So a lot of people diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder were or may have been diagnosed with conduct disorder, or at least have a history of conduct problems in school. They tend to be self-serving and manipulative, and again, lacking in empathy. Sometimes they are referred to as psychopaths or sociopaths. Antisocial personality disorder is primarily diagnosed in males. So that's one that you see more in men, borderline, you see more in women. In terms of family history, antisocial personalities may have, for instance, a male with antisocial personality disorder may have a sister with borderline personality disorder. So we sometimes see that pattern in families where a male might be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, and a female sibling might be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. We can also get into some of the disorders in childhood, neurodevelopmental disorders. And one of those is ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is characterized by inattention. People, and this is usually diagnosed first in childhood. Not always. There's some people who are diagnosed later on in adulthood with ADHD. But really, there are a couple of types of symptoms: inattention, hyperactivity, and poor impulse control. People with ADHD have poor impulse control. There's some evidence that the development of the prefrontal cortex is not what it should be, that it's underdeveloped in people with ADHD. One of the ways this disorder is treated is by giving drugs that increase activity in the prefrontal cortex, thereby facilitating impulse control and helping the individual stay on task. So again, this one typically is diagnosed in childhood because in classroom situations, the kid who is easily distracted, who gets up from his or her seat and runs to the window and does that kind of thing a lot, is being disruptive. So parents would then be notified, and often the kid is taken to a family physician who might do the diagnosis himself or herself and prescribe medication. The medication is typically a time-released stimulant drug. There are, I guess, the two most common drugs used to treat ADHD are Adderall, which is time-released amphetamine, and Ritalin or methylphenidate. And methylphenidate is a dopamine reuptake inhibitor. It helps to increase levels of dopamine. It has a mechanism of action similar to that of cocaine, but this drug typically helps people with ADHD focus. And another drug that has gained in popularity in recent years is Strattera, which is selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. It helps to increase norepinephrine levels, which also helps to facilitate activity in the prefrontal cortex. So those are the medications, and typically the treatment of ADHD is pharmacotherapy, and usually one of those three medications or some combination. Then we get into autism spectrum. Now, autism spectrum is one of those diagnoses that has changed in the DSM-5. But what you can see here, people who are diagnosed with autism spectrum, and again, this one is typically diagnosed in childhood. Children with autism spectrum disorder typically show disturbances in three areas. So deficits in social interaction, deficits in communication, and repetitive patterns of behavior, or repetitive interests. And again, these are on a spectrum. It used to be that if a person just had some relatively mild impairments but was still able to function in say, a typical classroom setting, that diagnosis might have been called Asperger's or Asperger's syndrome, Asperger's disorder. But now it's just called autism spectrum, but essentially high functioning. You might hear that term, high functioning autism. So high functioning autism and Asperger's are pretty much the same thing. But one thing that really characterizes autism spectrum is deficits in communication, deficits in social interaction. This is, it's a developmental disorder. It's something that, that certainly through training, people can learn to interact and communicate better. Sometimes children with autism spectrum might be given communication devices, perhaps a little keyboard that has symbols on it to communicate needs or desires to other people in the room. Let's see. I think that's pretty much it. Causes, controversial. One thing that's pretty well determined is the causes probably are not vaccine related. There was a study that was published a few years ago that indicated a correlation between vaccines and autism spectrum disorder, but that study was actually retracted because it turned out that the researcher fabricated data. In terms of environmental factors, it's still not really it's not really well understood, although the prevalence of the disorder seems to be increasing. All right, so that is it for chapter 15. So this is our chapter where we have discussed and characterized some of the more common disorders. What we're going to do next is go through chapter 16, and I'll get a video